Hello and welcome everyone to tonight's event with 192 Books. I am Evan, the manager here at 192 Books, and I am really thrilled tonight to be joined by Elias Khoury and Robyn Creswell. Tonight, they're going to be discussing current situation in Beirut and the Middle East, as well as Elias's latest book translated into English, Children of the Ghetto. My name is Adam, brought out by the lovely Archipelago Press that we love here at 192 Books. They'll be talking about that for most of the night up till about 6:45, and then after that you'll be able to ask both Robyn and Elias questions. If you have a question for either of them, you can send it to the email below, evan@192books, and I will get that to them. The earlier you send your question, the better chance you have of being answered tonight. So send them now if you have them. Send them whenever you think of them. Don't just wait till the end of the night. So first up, we're going to have Robyn Creswell, who's going to do a short introduction of Elias before they speak about the work. And Robyn is the assistant professor of comparative literature at Yale University, as well as a noted translator and essayist. He's also the author of the wonderful book, City of Beginnings, which we had an event for here at 192 Books not so long ago, and we love him. So I'm going to hand it over to Robyn now. And thanks, everyone. Enjoy your night.
Well, thank you, Evan, and thank you for everyone at 192 Books and the author at the Paula Cooper Gallery for making this possible. It's a real, true pleasure to speak with Elias about his latest novel, which is moving and thought-provoking and terrific. And I feel like in the interests of full disclosure, I should say that I've known Elias for a long time, that I was even a student of his at NYU, where I was a graduate student and Elias was a professor of Arabic literature. And NYU, which is the setting, in fact, for the frame tale of his latest novel, Children of the Ghetto. All this is to say that I read the opening scenes of this novel with a certain amount of nostalgia for the time when we were both in New York, and for those days when I had the chance to speak with Elias about the books and the poems that we were reading in class, usually at La Lanterna, Cafe La Lanterna afterwards. And also to listen to his always amusing, always revelatory, slightly scandalous sometimes stories about the real people who wrote the books and poems that we were reading. So it's a real pleasure to be able to take up this evening some of the threads of this old conversation that we used to be able to have, and to discuss this book in which there are so many, frankly, traces of the books that we read in his classes. I actually was expecting Evan to do an introduction of Elias. So I'll just say that Elias is, to my mind, really the foremost writer of the novel in the Arabic language today. I don't know, I actually don't have at my fingertips the number of novels that you've written, Elias. It's something like 10 or 11. I think some of the more famous ones are White Masks, Gate of the Sun, and Broken Mirrors, all of which have been published by Archipelago in translations, many of which, the last ones, published in Humphrey Davies's translation, as this one is, and he deserves special praise, I think, as a translator of Elias. So as Evan indicated, before we do talk about this novel, Elias, which we'll spend most of our conversations, our time speaking about, I did want to ask you, Elias is in Beirut, where it's midnight, about the state of the city in these days, in the aftermath of the enormous explosion that hit the port on August 11th. And of course, that disaster happened on top of the pandemic, happened on top of last year's protests, happened on top of the financial kind of collapse due to mismanagement and fraud, happened on top of the Syrian refugee crisis that has been going on since 2011. Tell me if I'm forgetting anything, Elias, but can you give us a kind of how you feel the city, a kind of health report for the city of Beirut these days, about 2 months after the explosion?
Thank you, Robyn. Actually, this is a great moment for me. And thank you for reminding everybody that the setting of this novel is in the neighborhood of NYU, where I worked for a long time and where we met. New York is very essential in this book. And always my relationship to New York was related to my relationship to Beirut. I had this feeling. I just finished writing an article about what happened in August the 4th with this huge catastrophe. And I began with referring to a poem by Mahmoud Darwish entitled Beirut, which was written in the late, in the early 80s. And the poem, one of the lines of the poem says, Beirut التفاح والقلب لا يهلك. Beirut is an apple. And I wrote it around this to speak about two apples, about New York as being the big apple, as the New Yorkers like to call her. And then now there is a new apple, which is a small apple. And when I wrote about this apple, I remember that I was reading this poem to my son, who was a child, 6 years old, and he was listening thoroughly. And then he told me, "Tufaha, an apple. Then can we eat it?" And so the first time I thought about how we can eat a metaphor, and I never thought that a metaphor can be eaten. Actually, we are witnessing a moment in Beirut where the metaphor of the city is eaten by monsters who did not stop destroying the city. There is a total collapse. Everything is collapsing. And for the first time in my life, I spent all my life in Beirut, I have the feeling that a city can die. I have the feeling that we are on the edge of the death of a city which, as some of you who must know the history of Beirut is a very modern city. Beirut was recreated in the 19th century, of course, an ancient city of the Roman times, but since then it became a small village. A city began in the 19th century around the port, and actually it's a port which has a city, not vice versa. And this city was the city of refugees who came to Beirut from all over. The first wave of which made Beirut a city. The first wave took place in 1860 in the Lebanese Civil War, in Mount Lebanon, where thousands of people leaving the site of the massacres found refuge in Beirut, and then refugees began coming to Beirut. Actually, it's a city of refugees. It's a city of strangers, and this is what gave Beirut its major specificity. And to see Beirut now being destroyed, the way it is destroyed, to see Beirut now being eaten by the Lebanese confessional system, because Beirut was never a Lebanese. It was, of course, the capital city of Lebanon, but it was never a Lebanese city. It was a Levantine city. It was the city of all the Orient. To see how this is happening, and we are unable to defend the city, it makes me feel so sad. And it opens a huge question about the experience, about our modern historical experience, about modernism, and I'm thinking about modernism in the broad sense, not only about literary modernism, about the whole process, the whole national process, and about this terrible failure that we feel we are facing now in Beirut, and Beirut as the mirror of the failure in the whole Arab region.
Elias, in the background, I just one kind of question, looking forward to the future, I suppose. In the background of last year's protests, there was a feeling, a pretty widespread feeling, I think, on the part of the protesters, a widespread complaint, I suppose, that the country's elite, its power elite, let's say, is both permanent and permanently corrupt. Lots of scholars and others and Lebanese themselves have noted that really in the aftermath of the Civil War, which ended in 1990, the leaders of the various sects, of all the sects really, exchanged their military uniforms for business suits, and they continued to run the country, more or less as if nothing had happened. And the alliances between sects, of course, did change, but the people and the kind of attitudes remained the same. And so one of the slogans of the protesters in the past year was "all of them means all of them," right? Kullun yani kullun. Do you have any sense in the aftermath of this latest disaster that anything kind of fundamental has changed in the attitude of the people who run the country?
Actually, I feel that a huge thing has changed of the Lebanese population, and I mean the protests were a demonstration that we are able to go beyond our different confessional affiliations and try to become people, to become a nation. But what is interesting is how this elite, how you call it an elite, and actually it's a mafia. The structure of the governing oligarchy of this country is more like a mafia structure, even without the laws of the mafia. That is, the mafia has some kind of codes. Here there are here there are no codes. Here this is a mafia, and what they have done during these 40 years since the end of the Civil War was to steal everything. Everything was stolen. We feel that everything was stolen, and now they are putting their hands in our pockets. All our money in the banks, we can خلاص, is over. All our savings are over, practically, and they have stolen. And the money is outside. Even the bankers who are part of this oligarchy, their own money is outside. It's not in the country. So the only thing, and what defended the system was a structural thing in the system itself. Always there was a militia, which is outside the army, which can help the army or can replace the army. In the times before the Civil War, till the beginning of the Civil War, the militia was the Christian militia, the Phalange party, this fascist. And after the end, and now, what we have faced during the demonstrations and the protest was, we felt that the militia became Hezbollah, unfortunately. And Hezbollah, who is supposed to be the resistance against the Israeli occupation, became the defender of the regime, because Hezbollah is related to a regional project which has nothing to do with Lebanon or with the Palestinian cause. And this militia practically frightened everybody and played a major role in the destruction of the uprising. So what we are witnessing now is that there is a governing class who cannot govern anymore, but there is no one to govern. We are in a very chaotic situation, which makes me feel very sad, because I'm witnessing the young people who are all trying to immigrate. Immigration, it's unbelievable. The only discussion between the young people who filled the streets of Beirut during the uprising is where to go, how to find a place, how to go to Paris or Canada or whatever, where are places which can be open to them. As if this history of Lebanon is repetitive, and you go back to the big immigration of the end of the 19th, early 20th century. We are in the edge of that. So I don't think I don't think Beirut can be saved if the Arab East is not saved, and I don't see any hope now in this situation around.
Well, that's a gloomy point to begin on.
I'm really
Hard to make a nice segue from this update, but thank you for indulging me and the audience in some questions about what's going on in Beirut, and that's really it's upsetting what's going on. There's no way to look at it other than that. But we do want to talk about the novel, and this novel, unlike many of your others, is not set in Beirut. It's for the most part set in New York and also in historical Palestine, and in particular in the city of Lud, or Lidda, which was the site of a massacre of Arab civilians in 1948, which is part of the story. And it's actually hard to know where to begin talking about this novel, because there are so many threads that are intertwined in it. And that's part of the pleasure of the novel. Of course, there's the thread of, there's the frame story, which involves a character named Elias Khoury, who comes across some manuscripts left by a curious, ambiguous sort of possibly Palestinian, possibly Israeli character named Adam Danoun, who turns out to have been a child raised for a few months in what contemporaries called the Ghetto of Lud, who then has a life in Israel and comes to the United States, comes to New York City, and becomes a falafel seller, where Elias Khoury meets him and inherits his manuscripts after his death. There's that story. There's also the story of Waddah al-Yemen, the 8th century love poet. There's also the story of the characters of Lud itself. So it is hard to know where to begin. But I'd like for you to read a passage, and we can take it off so that we have something concrete to start with. So tell us what you're going to read.
Okay, I'm going to read the first page of a chapter entitled Thirst, and it describes the relationship between Adam, the author of this, actually the author of this manuscript, whom we described very well, and his mother. But there is one thing very interesting about the story of Adam. Adam was discovered in New York when he was 55 or something. He will discover in New York that he was not the son of his mother or his father, and he was found on the breast of a dead woman who was his real mother in the exodus from Lidda to Ramallah, which happened in July 13th, July 1948. And this boy was raised in a small part of Lid, which was encircled by wires, and which the Israeli army called the Ghetto. And for these people who lived in that ghetto, when they heard the term Ghetto, they thought that Ghetto meant the neighborhood of the Arabs. They did not have any hint what is the origin of the word. Of course, actually, practically the Israeli soldiers brought that word from their European experience about the ghettos in Europe, because in the Arab world, in the Arab East at least, we never had ghettos. We had Harat al-Yahud, neighborhoods of Jews, like the neighborhood of the Christians, but never ghettos closed and so on and so forth. So As my mother told the tale, I was born in thirst. What happened? Hello?
I can see you. I
I'm
can
seeing
hear you.
nothing. I'm seeing nothing.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm here, but I see nothing. Okay,
We
so I
see you. I see you. So,
okay, so I can, now I see.
okay.
Okay, as my mother told the tale, I was born in thirst. Now, as I write about that woman who vanished from my life when I was 15, I don't know whether her lips were indeed cracked in parallel, straight lines, or if it's the image of thirst, which has pursued me since childhood, that transforms her thirsty lips whenever I recall her. She was my mother, and she was Manan, daughter of Atif Sulaiman of the village of Ailamoon in Galilee. When I remember her, I say Manal was, for to me she's like the first word in a sentence that was never completed. After I left the house at 15 to work in Mr. Gabriel's garage in Haifa, I discovered that the woman had passed through my life like a sigh of wind, leaving behind her nothing but her world of stories, and that the only things I could remember of her were her cracked lips, her wide almond shaped eyes, deep inside, whose pupils trembled a hint of dark brown, two fine, almost invisible lines on her cheeks, and a deep feeling that I had been abandoned so that I could live alone. I don't know what brought this woman of Galilee to Lydda, or why she fled from her village to join a hot and humid city under siege. Is that what love is? She said that one look from Hassan's eyes had been enough to change the course of her life. When she talked to me about Hassan, she would look at me with pitying eyes and say she'd been surprised that that boy Adam, meaning me, did not look like his father. Hassan was tall, dark skinned, and broad shouldered. His honey colored eyes held a flash like lightning, and his smile, which lit up his face, signaled his attitude to life. She said she'd met him in Ailamoon. He was with a band of the Holy Struggle Fidaiyin. He asked her about the village spring, so she walked with him, and instead of her taking him to the spring, he took her to his city.
Thank you. And again, I want to mention and appreciate Humphrey Davis's translation of this book, which is an especially fine one, it seems to me. One
You're
of the
totally,
things that,
you are
yeah.
totally right. Humphrey is great. He does a great job.
So one of the things I wanted to pick up out of this passage, you know, this is a story about a man who is discovering the secrets of his past and discovering that he is not maybe where he thought he was from, that his parentage is otherwise than he had always thought. But it's also a story about stories. He discovers all of this by way of people telling him stories about his youth. We can imagine in the future he might hear even other stories. But this is really like, I think at the heart of your concern here and in lots of other books is this question of storytelling. And it seems to me that you're not so much interested in sort of what the meaning of stories is as much as how stories work, how they relate to other stories, how they are related to writing and memorialization. And why we tell old stories sometimes or retell old stories for present purposes. So it seems as if in a lot of ways, Scheherazade has become a real muse for you. So maybe I can ask you just to tell us how this story, the story of Adam Danoon in particular, which is the kernel of this tale, it seems to me, how it came to you, how did it occur to you?
Actually, I don't know. Just. I mean, it's very difficult to answer this question because it came like all books, like all novels. It came in different phases, in different shapes. different stories. And actually, if you will see the first draft of it, you will not recognize the outcome because I had to. I don't only like to tell stories, but I rewrite stories all the time, as if stories you can never write a story, a full story. So you are making attempts of writing stories the way you are making attempts of telling stories. And in this sense, the first idea, the first hint came to my mind when I discovered by Hazel. I work in the center in the Institute for Palestine Studies since 10 years, and before when I was young, I used to work in the Palestine Research Center also, and I'm supposed to be a specialist in the Palestinian case, in the Palestinian history and social and society and so on, and just by Hazel, I discovered that after the occupation of Palestine and the creation of the state of Israel, all the major cities of Palestine, in all the major cities of Palestine, the Israelis created ghettos, and they called them ghettos. And nobody wrote about this. And I began searching for these ghettos. And then I discovered the ghetto of Lidda because it happened that I was in Amman and I went to Jabal Hussein, and in Jabal Hussein there is a huge, a big immigrant, a big number of immigrants from Lidda who told me stories. And then, but the personality of Adam, the Noon, and the story behind it was an attempt actually to write, to question writing, because this is why it began with Waddah al-Yaman, the story of this poet of the 8th century, of the Umayyad poet, who died in a box, and which was put, he was in love with the wife of the caliph at that time, and the wife put him in a box to hide him, and the caliph discovered him and took the box and buried it, and he died in silence. He died without speaking. This idea of silence, this idea of that the ultimate expression is silence itself. And I thought this can be parallel with the story of Ghassan Kanafani in the Sun. For those who are familiar with Kanafani, because the 3 heroes of Kanafani also died in a water tank. It was closed, and they did not cry. They did not knock. This is what Kanafani tells us. And I was questioning the idea of why the victim is silenced, the idea of the dialogue with silence. And then this is the first step. Then other steps came, and I had this story of Manal, the mother, which I thought is this woman is a fascinating woman. I was for some time in love with her because she is a very special woman. And I mean, I'm speaking about the character, not the real woman, of course. The real woman, if I will find her, I will be in love with her, of course. But this is another possibility. It never happened. Practically, Robyn, once this happened, you know this, when these young people of Palestine in 2014, they went and occupied a land which was confiscated by the Israelis to build a settlement, and they declared that this land is Bab Shams, the gate of the sun, referring to my novel. At that moment, I thought that maybe the characters of novels can be reincarnated in real life. But nonetheless, so then came the story of Manal, which I thought she's the woman that incarnates this deep relationship with the silence of the victim. And this silence is very noble. It's not because they are afraid, and not because they are traumatized only, but because actually silence is the only language to face the madness of history. There is no way to make a dialogue with a history which is mad, like the history of a catastrophe like the Palestinian Nakba or of any other catastrophe. Because in the second volume of this book, Adam will go and visit the Warsaw Ghetto and he will make the comparison between the two ghettos and so on and so forth. So any huge human catastrophes are a big challenge of our language. So as you see, between telling, because the story, I'm a storyteller, so I'm telling, and between silence, this dialogue between both, I think this makes the character of Adam, for me, very, very intriguing and interesting.
Do you think
And
there, you mentioned, multiple ways of telling stories and of telling stories of catastrophe and of horror. And I wonder if you think, between prose and poetry, there's a difference in the way that they can handle that kind of material. Because in this book, as in so many of your books, there are characters of poets. The characters quote a lot of poetry. Many of them love poetry, in fact, and they know a lot of it. And it's often seemed to me, reading novels of yours, I'm reminded of works of classical Arabic literature, not just like The 1001 Nights, in which, of course, there are many embedded poems, but also, a book like the Kitab al-Aghani, which is a huge compendium of stories about poets, in which poets themselves become kind of the legends, and their poems are quoted all over the place. And this is something that it seems to me modern Arabic prose literature has sometimes shied away from, this kind of poetic legacy that that it hasn't been clear how to incorporate this this inheritance from the past. But do you think that poetry or prose can handle that kind of the material that's at the center of this novel? That is to say, historical horror, trauma. Is there any difference in the way that novels and poems can deal with it?
no, actually, I don't think that. I think that neither prose nor poetry can deal with it. You have to put them together. I mean, you have to make a melange of a mixture, let's say, of these two approaches towards things. Poetry is a kind of you summarize. Poetry is the music of the summary of meaning, if you want to speak about what's poetry. And prose is the music of trying to search for the meaning. But when you are faced with a catastrophe, you are faced with the idea that life is meaningless. So how to give meaning? Actually, all catastrophes, they are they are very harmful, but they are meaningless. Historically speaking, I mean, humanly speaking, there is no reason to make all this. There is no rationale of the Vietnam War, whatever the Americans will tell us. There is no rationale of the Crusaders. There is no rationale of the Holocaust. Nothing. And there is no rationale of the Palestinian Nakba. So you are faced with the meaningless situation where you are trying to, to, to pick up the meaning from the details of the human life, of the human experience. So prose will take us to the details, and poetry will make us able to summarize, and putting them together. On the other hand, as you have mentioned, of course, and as you know very well, this is part of the classical Arabic heritage, which was forgotten for some reason. I don't understand why, which was forgotten in modern times. And I thought that when you go back and read these books, and go back, for example, to Abu Hayyan Tawhidi, for example, or others, you discover that these authors were intelligent enough to use the two levels of expression in order to arrive to a way of crystallizing human moments. So you are totally right. In my novels, there is always poetry, not because only, which is true, of course, that I love poetry a lot, and I know poetry by heart, but also because I think that this combination is a way of creating let's say, a style adequate to our modern experience.
Listening to you talk about that, you know, a kind of confrontation with meaninglessness, I'm reminded actually of a much earlier novel, one of your first novels, which is White Masks, White Faces.
Yeah.
White Faces, sorry.
The English translation gave it the title White Mask. I don't know.
Yeah, right. But which is a story set in the during the Lebanese Civil War. When you were writing it, it was a kind of, you wrote it as a kind of history of the present, or a writing of the present, but in which there's a kind of a character who ends up on a garbage dump, and for no good reason, for no reason that anybody can really explain, as so many deaths in fact happened during that conflict. And that was part of your, I suppose, among other things, political point, was that what seemed to be an ideological war, at least in its beginnings, had devolved into death dealing that had no real purport, had no meaning, and yet it's always the job of the prose writer who comes too late. You know, the writer always is arriving in the aftermath of this kind of violence, as I think is true of a lot of in your novels, that it's trying to make sense of violence or trauma in the aftermath of it, you know, trying to investigate not just what happened, but what we do with a certain kind of silence or a certain kind of meaninglessness. So I'm struck that project has continued in some ways, even though these books are so different.
You know, with age and with time and with I discover now, I'm discovering that there is a very secret line in my works, and as you said, there is a link, even if the setting is totally different, even if White Masks was written not in the aftermath, it was written during. Practically, White Mask was published in 1981, during the most terrible moments of the Lebanese Civil War, and just before the Israeli invasion of 1982. And here, in Gate of the Sun, or in Children of the Ghetto, I'm going back very long time in history and moving between the present and the past. I think there is a line about asking or questioning the meaningless of life, and with a hypothesis, and the hypothesis is that literature and art are the only way to give meaning to a meaningless life.
But temporarily, right? I mean, that seems to be also one of your themes, is the kind of that stories are made, yes, they're made to hold at bay those kinds of intimations of meaninglessness or absurdity or horror. They're made in the face of that, but they will also be retold, repurposed for present purposes. I mean, this is one of the things that I really wanted to ask you about. We once had a long talk about this phrase that you used, writing the present, which you used to describe what you were doing in the writing in your early novels in the Lebanese Civil War. That there was a certain kind of impatience you had with writing that was more, in one way or another, historical. That it was not dealing with the confusing, contingent matters at hand. That we didn't know where we were going. And yet it struck me that, so that's writing the present. And yet it struck me that, especially in the last few novels of yours, I'm thinking of Broken Mirrors and also Gate of the Sun, and also this one, there's so many figures of archives, of documents, of, in this case, notebooks that the narrator Elias Khoury receives from Adam Danoun. So there's both this ambition to write the present, but all these figures of the past and archives. And so how do these things relate for you? I mean, in Broken Mirrors, for instance, the character, the protagonist, ends up at the end of the novel carrying the memoirs of some Palestinian leftists, basically, or Marxists. And in this novel also, it's obviously about the notebooks of Adam Danoon. In Gate of the Sun, the protagonists collect stories of a sort. So there's these figures of kind of archive and history, but also with the ambition of writing the present. How do they relate for you?
Look, actually, the setting is the present. So if you take if we take Children of the Ghetto, the Children of the Ghetto, the setting is in New York, 2005. So it's the present. It's not 1948. So we begin with the present, and I think the present in it incarnates all this past. This past is part of this present. When we are dealing with, for example, I'm speaking about Palestine now, when we are dealing with the Nakba, which my hypothesis, and I published about that, a long article, that the Nakba is not a historical event, it's a process which is continuing till now. Now the Nakba is taking place in Palestine, not only in 1948. So we are in a situation where the present and the past are mingled practically, because there is no real separation between them. And in this sense, we begin with the present, writing the present, and we discover that we are also writing the past of this present, which is present in the present. That is, this past itself is present in the present. The other thing which I discovered, as you said, in my late work, and since maybe since the Gate of the Sun, is that literature is one of the major ways of the dialogue between the living and the dead. I don't think there is another way except religion, which is another story. But
that's for next talk. Yeah.
No, it's another story. Not our subject today. But I think that what the man invented, which will make the dialogue possible between the living and the dead, is literature itself. So in literature, also the difference, I mean, when I'm asked if I miss Mahmoud Darwish, I tell them, of course not, because when I miss him, I read him, so he is present, although he died some years ago. Yeah, 12 years ago. The same way as I believe that Al-Mutanabbi is between us, because I read him all the time. I go back to him. So this relationship, this dialogue with the dead is essential, I think, in the literary work. This is the only place where we can cross this border, which is impossible to cross except through literature.
That almost makes it sound like you're denying your grief, though.
I'm not denying my grief.
I mean, Darwish won't have any more poems. That's
what
worthy of mourning.
Okay, what do you mean not having any new poems? Actually, every poem, every reading of a poem will make it a new poem. The new thing is our eyes. When we read classical literature, we read them with different eyes from the people who lived in that period read them, or the people who lived 50 years later read them. So no. I think literature can reproduce itself through the readers, because I suppose profoundly that the major author is the reader, not the
writer. Let me ask a question about some reviews of Children of the Ghetto. A lot of them have focused on the final chapters of the novel, which describe the inhabitants of the ghetto of Lud being made by the Israeli army to dispose of, bury the civilians who were killed in the massacre in 1948, in July in 1948. The chapters are entitled Sonderkommando, which is a German word that refers to the units within concentration camps of Jewish prisoners who were made to dispose of the remains of those who were murdered in the crematoria. Now, some reviewers have objected to what they take is a comparison between certain events in the Nakba and the Holocaust, because I suppose they want to hold on to the uniqueness of the Holocaust as a moment of human evil. And Adam Danoon, for his part, at the end of the novel, he says, I don't want to draw a comparison between the Holocaust and the Nakba. I hate such comparisons and believe the numbers game is vulgar and nauseating. So the numbers game clearly is nauseating and meaningless, but are there other kinds of comparisons that would be more legitimate or useful? And does your novel, whatever Adam Danoon says, draw any of them?
Look, the Sonderkommando thing came because when I saw the film Show Up by Claude Lanzmann, I don't know if you have seen this long work,
yeah,
which I thought is a great work. There is a scene in this film when Lanzmann brings a group of Sonderkommando Jews who were in the concentration camps to tell their testimony, and by hazard, he didn't know. I suppose he didn't know where he was taking them. He took them to Ben Shemen, which is a colony, a Jewish colony on the edge of Lid. And from Ben Shemen, the brigade of Moshe Dayan that came and occupied Lidda came from Ben Shemen. So he brought this group of Sonderkommandos to Ben Shemen, looking over Lid, to tell their testimony of how they got rid of the remnants of the Jews killed by the Nazis. And down in the village, in the city itself, what I'm telling, the story I told about the Israeli army ordering the Palestinians to burn the bodies of the victims of the massacre of Lidda, which is also a real story. Under that, there was, and if you are in Ben Shemen, you can see the streets of Lidda. Now, if you go there, you find yourself. So it was a mere hazard, which made me use the term. Because the term was not used by me, it was used by Lanzmann himself, who was a dedicated Zionist, of course, everybody knows, and who made, after this film, who made a terrible film about Tzahal, the Israeli army, as being the most ethical,
morally,
army,
yeah,
moral army on earth. So the comparison came spontaneously, and it has to come. Otherwise, it will be that as if I am not daring to compare because it's uncomparable. Now, I think any human tragedy is unique. Every personal tragedy is unique, but this doesn't mean you cannot compare.
One other question.
Uniqueness doesn't mean the impossibility to compare, because everything is unique. Now in Beirut, I was telling you in Beirut because the region where I live was all the windows in my house were broken, and my daughter was injured and was hospitalized. My wife also, and and many neighbors disappeared and died. Every story of them is unique, and I understand the tragedy which we faced. And it was terrible to live it because I lived it personally. But uniqueness doesn't mean that you cannot compare this to other tragedies taking place anywhere in the world and other places of the world.
We have only 10 minutes, and there are some questions that the audience has asked. Here's one which I'll reframe it a little bit, which is about Edward Said.
Yes.
Your own introduction into New York City was, I think, if I remember the stories you told me, kind of at the hands of Edward Said, who invited you in the early 80s to come and lecture some of his classes at Columbia, and who wrote a very well-known kind of landmark essay, actually, about you and postmodernist fiction and Arabic fiction. And so I imagine that in writing a novel about New York, which is set partially in New York, you must have been thinking about Said and your time with him there. Does Said, but Said is certainly not a character in the novel. I don't think he appears in any obvious way at all. But am I missing something? Is there a kind of Saidian flavor to any of these scenes in the novel? Were you thinking of him while you were writing these New York kind of episodes?
Actually, Said is present. Actually, is the absent present in this novel. Said, for me, and the way I was introduced to New York, and the way I loved New York. I loved first of all, I loved New York through the eyes of Said, who was really fond of the city. And I know that he refused posts somewhere else in Harvard and other places because he wanted to stay in New York itself, because for him New York is very important. Now Said is and my personal experience with Said. First of all, when I read his introduction to Little Mountain, I was really astonished, totally astonished, because I knew him very vaguely at that time, and then I discovered this man who gave me what I thought at that moment that I didn't deserve. To be frank with everybody, I thought that he was very generous. But
he compared you to Naguib Mahfouz and said basically that you were taking over from where Mahfouz had left off.
Which at that time I thought it was a lot. At that time, just to be precise. But the way he saw New York, the way he saw the diversity, the way his cultural approach, his critical mind, his openness, all of this left major traces in my way of thinking and in my soul. Said, when I came to New York, he was a big professor. I was nothing, just a kid, yeah. And he was a great professor, and for me, and then I took his classes, and I think once I told you, the class of Said reminded me of the classes I used to attend of Foucault in the Collège de France. The same approach, the same theater, the same way of playing with words and playing with concepts and so on and so forth. Of course, Said is everywhere, and the New York I love. I always say this is the New York of Edward Said. Now afterwards, I had to discover New York on my own after he died in 2003, and at first it was very tough. Then I began planning to write something about New York, and I failed till I found this manuscript, which was given to me by one of my students, and so.
It's always struck me in our conversations about Beirut, where I did live a long time ago for a year or two, and your appreciation for that city, which I think is, in part at least, based on its history as a refuge for immigrants, that that's what gives it its vibrancy, its identity, is that it's always in fact changing. That this is a real historical rhyme with New York, of which the same thing can certainly be said, and Said was one of those immigrants that gave it its color and vivacity and interest.
And this
Here's
now the concept of exile. We don't want to speak about that. I mean, there are many questions, but the concept of exile, as it was formulated by Said, which is of course part of large, of a huge heritage of the idea of exile from Irbak to Adorn, so on and so forth, is something, for me, it made me understand Beirut better. So actually, I feel when I'm asked why you don't leave Beirut, why you don't go to exile, I said I'm in exile. Actually, I don't need the exile to become intellectual. Beirut is an exile in a sense. Yes.
Yeah. No, it's good that we've come back to to where we started in some sense, with New York and Beirut as places of exile. I mean, do you come back to New York these days with I don't know when the last time you were in the city was, but has it changed very much from your memories of it as they're coded in the book?
Actually, the place itself is did not change at all. I mean, Lanterna is still there, Ma'moon is still there. The places frequented, in the surroundings of NYU, till the last time I was there, since 3 years, 2 years, I think. Things were the same. Now I don't know what happened. I was there when September 11 took place also, and I witnessed the catastrophe the same way as I'm now witnessing catastrophe. Just of course the comparison is huge, is impossible, because the difference is huge. But nonetheless, no, the place, and the important thing in New York that it always changes. I mean, if city like New York will not change it, it's not New York. So nothing will be astonishing for me to find that it changed a little bit or a lot or something like that. But as you love New York, Robyn, I know how much you love the city. I also love the city.
I do, and I feel for its plight these days. It's we'll get through it, but I hope Beirut will too. Looking towards the future, a last question. We only have about 3 minutes, but somebody very generously asked what we're working on, what we're both working on right now. I'm more interested to hear what you're working on, but I should say that the book I'm working on, actually, since we were talking about poets, I'm trying to write kind of history, an intellectual history of the modern Middle East, that is to say, the post-Nakba Middle East, but as told through the lives and works of poets. So I'm very much hoping that when I finish it, that Elias is going to give me his commentary, because he knows he knows all the poets personally and can tell me some good stories about them.
This is a pleasure and an honor to be your reader, Robyn Habibi. About me, I'm finishing. I wrote recently. I wrote a play. Hopefully, it will be performed in Beirut. But when things can be done, and I'm now finishing the last volume of The Children of the Ghetto, which is entitled "A Man Who Bishbahni." How say Bishbahni? Looks like me. Resembles me.
Looks like me. Yeah.
No. Which is the last part of the novel, and for me it's very interesting because I went back to my love of poetry, and you will see, and I went back to Gate of the Sun and make the link between the whole setting of this Palestinian tragedy that I tried to to investigate and to understand and to put my small perspective in it.
Well, we have that to look forward to, I guess. Even if we don't have much else to look forward to these days, there is literature. So we've run out of time, and I think Evan wants to say a few words in parting. But for my own part, Elias, it's been really wonderful to see your face, to hear your voice, to know that you're out there thinking and working, and we'll talk soon. And then thank you everybody for joining this conversation.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you both to Elias Khoury and Robyn Creswell for that wonderful conversation. So interesting and so enlightening, and it does feel good just to talk about literature. Speaking of which, we have Elias's books here at the store. We're open every day for browsing, 11 to 5 until 6 on Friday and Saturday. We also have Robyn's wonderful book also here in store. So come on by whenever you can, or send us an email. We'll hold a copy for you. And if you can't make it to the store, or you're from somewhere else in the country or the world, we've got links below right on this page to buy the book through our bookshop.org page. Later this week, Friday the 16th at 6 p.m., we'll be joined by Renato Morocco and Edmund White to discuss Oscar Wilde in honor of his 166th birthday and this new book, Oscar Wilde's Italian Dream. And next Tuesday, 6 p.m., on the Paula Cooper Gallery website, we will be joined by Rosanna Warren and Christopher Benfey to talk about Rosanna's new book, Max Jacob, A Life in Art and Letters. So look forward to those. And again, thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And good night.
سلمني على أهل بيروت.
الله يخليك.